gentlemen, members of the Queens Chamber of Commerce, members of the citizenry of the Borough of Queens, New Yorkers, etc. Welcome to a State of the Media presentation put on by the Queens Chamber of Commerce and some illustrious editors and publishers of the Queens media world. Great to have you here at 2 o'clock on the 19th of January. We've assembled an all-star cast, which will be introduced in a few moments by our commentator and our host, Jeff Simmons. But before that, just want to introduce myself. My name is Tom Grech. I run the Queens Chamber of Commerce. I have arguably maybe the best job in the world. It's the most fun I've ever had in my entire life. And it's great to be a cheerleader for small businesses and then some in Queens. I'm not going to tell you how difficult the last year has been because you all know it, you've all lived it. But a couple things to look forward to. First and foremost, it's the 110th year of the Queens Chamber of Commerce. We got some things on tap to get going. I also wanted to tell you that we kicked off today, along with 6 other organizations in the great borough of Queens, a $20,000 grant funding opportunity brought to us by the fine folks at New York City EDC, as well as the Stephen and Alexandra Cohen Foundation, the new owners of the Mets. So that'll be a great shot in the arm. There's more information at the Queens Chamber website. We'll be all over social media in the coming hours, but we're very excited to not only partner with EDC and our fellow organizations in Queens County that we love working with, but this will be a great shot in the arm to all of our small businesses in Queens. Without further ado, we've got an action-packed segment today, the first of its kind. I want to introduce you to a friend of the Queens Chamber, star of small screen and radio, and that is the one and only Jeff Simmons of Jackson Heights. Jeff, it's all yours.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you to the Queens Chamber and yourself and Jeff Gross for organizing this discussion today. I'm honored to have this opportunity to discuss the state of media in Queens. As a former full-time journalist myself at New York One News, New York Post, New York Daily News, and back in the day across the Hudson at the Bergen Record in New Jersey, I've seen firsthand how newsrooms have evolved over time, and I've borne witness to the advent of new technology, to the shifting landscape of news, to changes in ownerships of the outlets, and unfortunately to cutbacks and layoffs amid some challenging times. The overarching question that we will explore today is how COVID-19 has impacted journalists and newsrooms in our borough and how they are going to operate differently in 2021. Back in April of last year, the Poynter Institute had begun publishing ongoing updates on newsroom closures, layoffs, and furloughs caused by the coronavirus across the country, tracking this state by state. And here at home in New York, we saw a number of outlets that had to adjust. Papers like the New York Post and Daily News, Tribune Publishing, Jewish Week, the New York Times, and Schnepp's Media, which owns a number of community papers, including several here in Queens, had to cut jobs and also transition to new operations, as did online outlets like BuzzFeed and Vice. This wasn't just about journalists, but about advertising. And in some cases, newsrooms shifted to nearly fully remote operations or even moved their offices. It was reported that the media industry suffered close to 31,000 job cuts in 2020, and that was up by more than 10,000 from the year before, according to an outplacement firm that had done a study that came out just earlier this month. At the same time, COVID-19 and breaking news involving the presidential administration, elections, and the movement for racial justice fueled coverage, both national and local, and that required more attention and more resources from the outlets like those who've assembled today. So with that, I'd like to get to the discussion with a prestigious panel of panelists today, media experts. But before I introduce them, quick thing for those of you who've tuned in. On Zoom, at the bottom, you will see the Q&A button. If you've got a question for me to pose to the panelists, please put that in the Q&A section, and I will be monitoring that throughout this. I'll introduce the panelists in alphabetical order, and then midway through this hour, I will start asking some of your questions unless I see that they relate to the topic that we're discussing at hand. So joining us today, Tony Barsamian, publisher of Queens Gazette, Queens Scene, Queens Penny Saver. Katie Bliss, publisher at Metropolitan Airport News. David Brand, managing editor at the Queens Daily News; Christian Murray, publisher and editor of the Queens Post; Walter Sanchez, editor and publisher of a number of publications, including the Queens Ledger, Brooklyn Star News Group, This is Queensborough Magazine, the Daily News Ticker at the Queens Ledger and Brooklyn Star newspapers; and Mark Weidler, publisher and president at the Queens Chronicle. Again, I'll pose some questions to the whole group, so feel free also if you want to raise your hand, any of our panelists, if you'd like to interrupt, if you hit the raise your hand button, or feel free when I just throw out a question, if you'd like to just jump in. With that, I'm going to go in alphabetical order and ask each one of our panelists to start the same questions, starting with Tony Barsamian. Talk about a little more about your news operation and the biggest challenge you faced in 2020. Tony?
Hi, thank you. It's a privilege and an honor to be here in such a beautiful organization. The Queens Chamber of Commerce does so many great things in Queens. But the bottom line is, to answer your question, it's been a very trying year for us in the media. We've lost so many of our restaurants. Most specifically, restaurants have been the most impacted and hurt by everything going on. They invested tons of money building outdoors, then they were told they can't use them, then they were let indoors, and then they were told we can't go back indoors. The restaurants, which represent a big chunk of our Queens being the most diverse county in the world, had the most restaurants from different cultures and different cuisines, and they were all suffering. How we covered it personally, we've tried to get by working with each and every one of our clients and each and every one of our advertisers on a one-on-one basis to help them get through this. We have found that the biggest challenge was that there are no events to cover. We have spent an entire, century almost, 40 years now, covering events and covering get-togethers and parties and challenges like that, and concerts and so many things. This year, there was nothing at all. 2020 resulted in virtually no events, and the few that existed were by, like this one, Zoom, or whatever get-together you have that you want to use. But the good news, and I'm sure my fellow publishers will join in with me, is our online presence, because people are home and maybe they're working from home and a little bored. Our online presence has been booming. That's the only bright, optimistic thing I can say about 2020 into 2021. The number of people tagging us through social media as well as on our website has been extraordinary, much higher than any previous year in terms of the percentage increase. But it has been daunting and challenging. I cannot imagine that we would have ever thought we'd face this when we had bad years like 2008 with the last big recession, or 2001 with the 9/11 disaster and the attacks. Those were bad times. But we never saw the impact like this, at least not at my level. I know my fellow publishers will chime in and share, but it has been a challenge. I think we've met the challenge, all of us as publishers, by providing the community with the local news that they need. Our niche, all of us, is to cover what's going on in Queens for the most part. And I think we've been successful on that level. It's just been very difficult. That's it in a nutshell from my end.
Thanks, Tony. Let me go over to Katie Bliss. Talk about the state of your newsroom and the biggest challenge you faced in the last year.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, thank you for having us, all of us, to be able to give information about the state of media in Queens, which is, like Tom said, it's a very niche little group of us, competitive for sure, but also just reaching our Queens communities, which is the most critical part of what we're doing. For us, my publication is based solely on airport business, community, workforce. So everything kind of shut down, right? It shut down for all of us in whatever niche that we're in. The people went home. The people that pick up my paper at the air train, or they pick up, they pick up my paper at the air train and they pick up my paper in their break rooms, and they pick them up in the cafeterias and in the bank branches that are at the airport. Those people weren't there. And even if they were there, they weren't picking up anything, right? Which was another part of the problem in the beginning. People didn't want to touch anything that they thought somebody else might have touched. These things were not going to their homes like many of my colleagues here, where papers are going to people's homes. These were not in people's homes. They were out into the public. So we have always had a very robust online presence. So yes, our numbers went through the roof as well. We were already poised for that, so we didn't have a major shift to go there. It was organic for us. So getting back on track, putting the papers back out there, we shifted from a newspaper template to a news magazine template, and I think that people are really appreciating that switch, something new to look at. And as our businesses start to come back and our employees start to go back to work in our community, everything is really just picking up for us as well at this point.
Thanks, Katie. Now on to David Brand. Now, full disclosure for our viewers today, David's my co-host on WBAI, but this isn't about radio today. David, talk about one of the biggest challenges you faced at the Queens Daily Eagle over this last year.
Thank you, Jeff. And yeah, it's good. Jeff, usually disembodied voice as we're talking on the radio. We do the show remotely now, so it's nice to actually see you here on Zoom as we talk. And I hope this wasn't nepotism. I think you would have invited me anyway, because editor of the Queens Daily Eagle. We do daily print newspaper, and our website is queenseagle.com. Happy to be here and kind of talk about the state of Queens media from the reporter and editor perspective, because it's been a challenge. And one of the biggest challenges is, I think, something that is always a challenge, and that's just small newsrooms, smaller operations, trying to figure out what we're going to cover, how to really make a dent in a place as large as Queens, to cover, a pandemic, politics, social justice movements, the court system, development, social justice issues, that have been around for decades now, homelessness, and do it in a way that is impactful, that's substantive, that holds leaders accountable, that tells the stories of individuals, and to lead on some of this coverage and not feel like we're just rehashing some of the same things that have been told. And I think there are so many stories to tell, and one of the challenges is trying to use our time wisely and tell the stories that are going to have the biggest impact, and find the stories that are unique, and find the stories that a lot of the larger publications that tend not to focus on Queens are not covering, and to bring those to the fore. And I think that's always a challenge, and I think more so now. And as we look into the rest of this year, we have like 300 people running for council seats in Queens. And so that's kind of what I'm dealing with now, on top of everything else, just figuring out how are we going to focus on all of these races? What are the important stories we're going to tell about these elections that are going on? And so I think, using small staffs to tell a lot of stories and to tell big stories is his challenge right now.
Thanks, David. And I want to go over now to Christian Murray, publisher and editor of the Queens Post. We crossed paths years ago, and I've been following his publications, or I'll say his online outlets, because I follow the Jackson Heights Post regularly. Christian, talk a little about the biggest challenge you faced over the last year, because you had a lot of robust online content. So was the transition actually easier for you this past year?
I mean, superficially, you could say that it hasn't changed much, because we have always been an online publication. But a little bit along the lines of what David is saying is that we've had to change a little bit, in the sense of, our local content has primarily been, parks opening, new real estate developments, police issues, courts and things like that. But lo and behold, things have had to change dramatically. You got to look at COVID-19, and it's an international thing, and you've got to look at it and think, well, how does this, relate to, parts of Queens? And obviously, you've had zip codes that have been hit hard with COVID and in Queens, as we all know. So therefore, you've got to gear your coverage for that. And it's, not, it's so vastly different than, meat and potatoes, like a real estate development coming along. So therefore, from an editorial standpoint, we've had to sort of had to look at the global aspect and look at it on a local level as well. So that's been a significant adjustment. And then a little bit like what David was saying, I mean, we like to at least come out with 1 or 2 stories a day that is unique to our publications, that isn't, you get a lot of press releases and things like that, but we want to have our own thing, and we want to find 1 or 2 things that we can put our sort of stamp on. So that's something very important to us. And then looking at it from a publisher standpoint, because I'm sort of now wearing two hats. I'm no longer so much a reporter, but I'm also handling the business side with the help of Serena Andres, who's with me. And, I've had to deal with like advertisers and a little bit like what Tony was saying. I mean, it's hard to sort of knock on the door of a restaurant and say, hey, listen, we're helping you, we're promoting you, but they're closed. So therefore, you've got to balance those relationships too. So it's been a very, difficult time in terms of business and in news. And of course, the other thing about news is there's been so much more of it. So therefore, staff numbers, you've got to look at your staff numbers, but there's been so much more news than I've ever seen while, covering Queens. So these are just some of the challenges that we've had to contend with.
Thanks so much, Christian. I'd like to next go to Walter Sanchez. Talk about the biggest challenge you faced this past year, but also as you're discussing that, what was an opportunity that might have crossed your path? What was a new opportunity that you achieved as a result of dealing with the challenge?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks for having this. I'm going to say I have two offices, one out in Rockaway, the Wave. It's been a long time institution paper out in Rockaway, and the Queens Ledger group, the 6 papers that cover Queens there is in Woodside. And I got to say the uncertainty of staff health more than anything was they felt, especially for the first month and a half, their friends were losing their jobs. They didn't know what was happening. We didn't lay people off right, but we did for a little while until we got the PP. We're back up to full staff. We were back up pretty quickly in August. And that I think was the biggest challenge. We knew we were going to lose some advertising, but the institutional advertising, really helped us with the COVID. The government the city wanted to let people know what was going on with COVID, testing and things like that, and the election helped us some election ads there. I would say the second biggest challenge was the free distribution. Many of our papers are paid. We're still on newsstands. We're still on more than about 130 newsstands throughout Queens, but we do have some free distribution, and that had to change. People weren't going to supermarkets. It's come back a bit now, but that has changed. So those are our two biggest challenges, I think. The new opportunities, we ran some with our paid papers. We ran some subscription promotions, and in fact, we started a decent deal of home delivery, especially out in the Rockaways, and they pay for it, obviously. And we found some pretty good success with our subscription programs. And we've started to do some polling, some digital polling. We have daily newsletters, and we've started to do some polling, and it's and even political polling, and it's pretty cool. It's a new challenge that we have, and we like what it does for our brand.
Thanks very much, Walter. Finally, let's go over to Mark Weidler, publisher and president of the Queens Chronicle. Talk about a challenge you faced in this last year, and also then just segue into one of the opportunities, something new that you were able to discover and do that helped you connect with audiences.
Thank you for having me. Just the overall problem of keeping everything together. There was no playbook for this. We never dealt with anything like this before. So we had to figure out every way to manage expenses, whether it was the distribution and the editorial and the sales and how do we cut expenses? How do we look for every available grant? Obviously the PPP grant, the EIDL grant, Google had a grant. So, I did everything I could to try to find those opportunities. And then on the expense side, I didn't lay off any of my editors, but I cut back some people who were working 5 days a week to 3 days a week. Certainly salespeople, there was much less for them to do out there. And when it came to distribution, we lost so many of our distribution drops. So we did some more home delivery. We delivered to more apartment buildings. Everybody was, people were still going to supermarkets. So we did a lot of second and third day delivery of the supermarkets. There weren't senior centers and libraries to deliver to. So we had to find other places to deliver the paper. And certainly with the revenue side, a lot of, pretty much all the print newspapers, we rely on legal notices, and the courts were closed for a period of time. So we had that loss of revenue besides the local retail stores. So, it's still, things seem to have stabilized somewhat, but with the local business community struggling, you know, we can only do as well as our local businesses. And if they're struggling, we really can't do well. We were fortunate to, you know, when the pandemic first exploded, we were getting ads from hospitals and other corporate accounts, which helped us to make up for some of the loss in the local business. But that lasted for a few months, and then that went by the wayside. You know, we do whatever we can to work with our local customers. If we have to lower our prices because they have less revenue, we do what we can to help them. But, you know, it's, you know, with the lack of, everybody relies on getting new business. You know, when new businesses open, it's, you know, great opportunity to advertise. And there are fewer and fewer new businesses opening. So that's another problem that we're dealing with. So, you know, I'm optimistic about the future. Only because of the vaccine. We have to hope and publish stories as much as we can about the expansion and the availability of vaccines. We posted a story on Friday night about at Aqueduct Racetrack that they were opening the racetrack to vaccines on Monday. And we posted a story, and just over the weekend, there were over 30,000 views of the article, dozens of comments. And, you know, I feel great about that we can provide these services because the people need to know it. And as Queens publishers, we have to, this is what people care about. So we have to provide that for them.
Thanks, Mark. And given what you just said about Aqueduct, I will say stay tuned for some news from the Queen's Chamber on this. All of you can probably call Tom right after this webinar and ask what the news is, and he'll tip you off. And now our listeners know he has some good news to share coming up on that. You've touched on some of these issues throughout. I know, Katie, you brought up a very good point that I was familiar with because I heard people say this as well, that they weren't sure early on in the pandemic what they should touch, you know, and that's why it affected the distribution of hard copies. I've been fortunate to have several news boxes right around the corner from me, and happy to see that they're being repopulated once again. In this beginning of the new year, as we're seeing the surge again here in the state, yet at the same time, the vaccine being distributed, are you now forecasting over the next, say, 3 months, 4 months, that things will get back to as close to normal when it comes to not just covering the news, but really distributing the news? Kate, starting with Katie.
Yeah, I'm absolutely hopeful. A lot of the places that we were distributing to within the community, and when I say the community, out into the community away from the airports, places where employees of the airport are living and working, they're coming back. So that's, you know, the typical newsstands, coffee shops, delis, they're all, you know, open and busy as they were, you know, right before the pandemic. So that's great. We are seeing it move there. We're seeing ridership on the air train increase slowly, but we are seeing it increase, and people coming back to work. But again, they're not coming back to work the 5 days. They're coming back to work 1 or 2 days here and there. So the volumes are definitely lower. But yes, people are taking papers out of those boxes where they were not in March and April. None of them were moving. So we just, we would put some, and then we would test it, and they would be there. So they are starting to move now. I think that people are more comfortable now. I think people understand more about this virus than they ever really wanted to know, and that they know how to keep themselves safe and still be out in the world while we're waiting for the vaccine.
I want to go over to Tony, because you said something at the outset that was very important. You talked about that there were no events to cover, and I know a lot of folks, including the Queen's Chamber, shifted over to virtual. Do you see this continuing for even the news outlets having more virtual events in the future to connect more directly with readers and the public?
I imagine that the future will have a synergy between the live events that we used to always have and people being able to Zoom in or Google in or whatever the connection is that they have, or FaceTime it. And I think that way people will be able to join things that they can be at live, and you can actually increase the number of participants by doing it on 2 levels. Now, that's not something we would have thought of 2 years ago so quickly. We would have done it live and then maybe streamed it later on after the fact as a video or something. Now we're trying it in and thinking that when things come back to normal, we'll have our wonderful event and there'll be many people at it, whatever it may be. And then we'll also at the same time have an opportunity for our readers, our local residents, our participants to come in through Zoom and every other way they can. That way you'll have more people involved. That is our hope, that that's the bright side of having this new technology that's helping everybody stay connected. And ultimately the goal is to have everybody connected one way or the other. So I would be optimistic that we can build on it. But I know so many people that are saying they can't wait to get back to the real world. And I'm one of them.
I agree. Did anyone else want to respond to what Tony just said? Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, Tony's so right. We're probably going to get into the video. Just don't be surprised if you don't see a Western beef sign in the background. Because we're going to sell advertising and sponsorships for that in order to get that to work for us. Otherwise, we're just wasting our time and spinning our wheels, with the news. We've got to be able to sell it.
Mark, let me go over to you for a second, because everyone has kind of touched on advertising a little. And obviously, a few of you have mentioned this about how restaurants in the hospitality sector has suffered. But where do you see, or where did you see increasing revenue actually increase? Were there specific sectors? And as we move ahead, this year, I bring up the politics again, just as far as what David said, with 300 candidates possibly in Queens that are going to be running, all of them are going to want to get their message out and smartly go to Queens papers. Where do you see, where did you see some strength in advertising last year and moving ahead?
Certainly with healthcare. We got a big buy from Northwell, NYU Langone. There were a few other, and New York Presbyterian of Queens. So we did well with that. And also, New York City did a tremendous amount of advertising. I assume it was in all of our publications, whether it was web ads, alerting people to COVID, washing their hands, and everybody be careful with it. And also, there was a lot of census advertising with census workers not able to go door to door. They were doing a lot of web advertising and also print advertising. So the city certainly stepped up and helped. The mayor began a campaign to increase the amount of his advertising budget in community and ethnic media, and I saw a tremendous growth in 2020. So that was one source that helped us tremendously.
David, you touched on the type of coverage that the Queens Daily Eagle does on a daily basis. You're largely a one-man band. I know that Rachel has ongoing stories, and you set up, what was interesting to see this past year is you set up partnerships with other media outlets such as Spectrum New York One News. Do you foresee that being the way of the future too, for outlets not only to survive, but to expand their reach?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think collaboration is key on a lot of this stuff. And so we have that partnership with New York One to share stories on the New York One website and on the Spectrum News app. And that's been really cool for getting our stuff to a larger audience. And also, to me, just personally incentivizes even more of like the in-depth exclusive reporting, because now it's kind of a double opportunity to get it online on our site, get it in print, and then to also share it to a larger audience through a large organization like them. But in terms of collaboration, like I've worked with Gotham Gazette this year. Back in May, Ben Max, the editor of Gotham Gazette, reached out to partner on some stories about Queens Assembly and state Senate races, because much like this year with council, so many races for state office last year, not quite as many candidates. But that was a cool way to split up some of these races and to feature them in our paper and on Gotham Gazette. Did that with city limits as well on some stories. And I know, I think that's something that is more people are favoring, or more people are seeking out those kind of collaborative approaches. And, I think a big help for us too is that we have the city, great news resource that's making their articles available for other news organizations to publish, same with Chalkbeat. So just from my perspective, running a daily print newspaper, we always need content. Every day it's a blank paper, so we need content, and those types of collaborations are good, or those kind of like open source stories are awesome. One thing that I do want to say, when I can't really speak to the advertising so much, I know some of our panelists talk about advertising. You hear a lot about supporting local news, and it's become a platitude almost, like people just cherish their local publications, or so they say. But I think more people now are starting to put their money where their mouth is and realize after many years of getting this stuff for free that it's not free to make. And it's a lot of work, it's a lot of money. And as we see publications closing, we see publications letting go of staff members, unfortunately, that hopefully this is kind of striking that realization in people that they need to put their money where their mouth is. And if they're looking at news every day, if they rely on this local news coverage that they're not getting from larger organizations, better resource organizations, they need to start paying for it. And whether that's, you know, small monthly sustaining donation or a contribution, a one-time contribution to say thank you for all the work local news resources have been doing, that's what I'm hoping comes out of this pandemic as well, is that people are actually seeking out ways to pay for this news coverage.
Christian, I want to go over to you because, you know, I follow the Jackson Heights Post a lot, and you have very good local coverage that matters to me and my neighbors, something we would often talk about in our hallways. And I'm just curious, with the COVID vaccine being distributed, a question came in from one of our viewers today. You know, I'm going to just recast it slightly. The question was, do you see the light at the end of the tunnel now that the vaccines are being circulated? But how long do you think, you know, how do you balance the COVID coverage versus other neighborhood coverage when you don't have much resources, but you know people want to know everything going on in their communities? How do you make those decisions in 2021?
Very, very difficult, Jeff. I mean, I have to really look at things, and, you know, like today, I mean, you know, the mayor said we're going to run out of vaccines, end of Thursday. And I'm thinking to myself, well, how does that really apply to people in Queens? And, you know, I'm thinking to myself, well, you know, the Daily News is going to have that. The New York Post is going to have that. So I've got to sort of weigh up these things. But then I also know that, hey, this is very significant. So, you know, I think to myself, okay, there's a lot of people in Queens that have appointments. You know, I speak to a guy in my building, he's like 65, 70. He goes, hey, Chris, can't get an appointment until April, you know, and I'm thinking to myself, well, you know, guys like him, it really matters. So therefore I sort of weigh it up and I go, right, we're going to cover that. So, you know, we do cover these things and we have to cover these things, but then I've also got to balance it. I've got to have, you know, the local business and what's happening to it, because otherwise we're not unique. We don't have a niche. Go read the New York Post if you want to read about vaccines, etc. So we always have to balance that. I always want to have something that's local, yokel, but I also want to have, you know, stuff that is, you know, more global in scope that does also apply to local people. So it's a very difficult challenge, actually. And
I'm glad you said that. Something that Walter had said before that stuck with me too, because I know a reporter for a daily newspaper in our area who has been repeatedly assigned to go out on location because some of her colleagues refuse to go in person to these locations. And Walter, you had mentioned that too. How do we strike that balance? Now we are in that period right now when more people are being vaccinated. At the same time, we have a surge. So Walter, how do you strike that balance if you have a reporter who says, I'm uncomfortable going in person to this event, but you know you need to cover this event?
We'd probably send somebody else. I mean, we just hired a reporter who was with the Post and was in that situation, with the New York Post, was in that situation. We were sent in to a hospital after COVID. A few people caught it, they left, he ended up catching it. So, you know, a lot of stuff there's so much to cover. I mean, and we still have original content all over the place. I would, you know, have to see if somebody else was comfortable going, but we haven't had that problem yet. I mean, all of these meetings, the borough board meeting, you could do it all by Zoom and cover it and do a decent job. But, you know, the balance is, you know, the people are working at home. People are still working at home. And they're able to find the new normal of how to cover things and how to work your sources, you know, working from home half the time. So we're pretty satisfied with the coverage that we're getting.
So we have a few questions that have come in. One that is interesting. I'm going to read it and then I might recast it slightly. What is your general demographic? Who do you picture when you say our readers? And the second part of that was any initiatives in getting other demographics like young people involved in the readership now, given COVID and everything. Katie, let me start with you. I guess I'd like to go around. Let me just start with you to ask about your demographic and also what you might be doing in 2021 to appeal to new readers.
Yeah, absolutely. So because we are a niche publication, our readers are across every age group, right? They're employees, they're workers, they're executives, they're government employees, they're business owners, they're trying to do business to business, they could be aviation enthusiasts. We have historical pieces almost every month in our publication about, literally the New York area being the cradle of aviation and how aviation started in this area. And we have a historical writer who puts these pieces together for us. So we have people across the gamut. Who we would love to attract more, of course, is more business owners, more people that are looking to do business in the airports, to connect to the people that we are already connected with. That's where it would tie back, obviously, into our advertising dollars. So we would love to pick up more of those. And our other big group is civic associations. So the airport community is very big on Chamber of Commerce. We obviously are part of the Queens Chamber of Commerce. We also have a JFK Airport Chamber of Commerce, and we have a JFK Airport Rotary Club and a LaGuardia Kiwanis Club. And there are a lot of people involved in those organizations that look to us for news and for help sustaining themselves.
Tony, let me go over to you. What do you consider your readers? And in 2021, will you be doing anything to kind of reach out to other types of readers, younger readers in particular?
It's always been a challenge because the community newspapers have always been geared towards, in my generation, people that were either residents, homeowners that worked in the community and had a vested stake in the community. And many of them had children, which made them even more likely to want to read it, whatever was in our newspapers, as to what was going on in their neighborhood, what was going on in their neck of the woods. And so we always catered from the newspaper angle to people 30 and over. But about 7 years ago, we created a magazine, a glossy color magazine full of art and Astoria type events that are going on to tie into the growing, changing Astoria community. We made that a much younger clientele, a much younger readership that was more about what was going on in the art world and what was going on in the booming Long Island City district. And so we try to balance it. Our view of it is eventually we want everybody to read everything always, but ultimately, realistically, we try to make a large part of the Gazette newspaper more for people who have a vested stake in the community and interest. And then we make our magazine publications and a lot of our online and social media, which we go to a different niche with. We try to cater that towards up and coming events and happenings and things that are more geared towards our younger readers. So when something goes on in the community that's very much geared towards people in their 20s to 30s, we're going to highlight that and go nuts with it on social media as well as through our magazine. When something is going on for people over 50 that involves something going on in their community, whether it's somebody's building something that neighbors might be opposed to, for example, that we're going to go heavily within the newspaper at the Queens Gazette. Well, we try to balance it, and we also print different newspapers in different areas to try to tie in locally to what caters to the people in that geographic destination. But our readers tend to be from the different angle, from the different neighborhood in their own way. They want to read what's going on in their backyard. They want to know what's happening in their neighborhood. And that's what we try to make as the overwhelming rule of thumb for us.
And David, I'm curious because, being a daily reader of the Daily Eagle, I see you focus a lot on the legal system and courts. And I don't know if that has assisted with advertising or not, but just as far as news coverage, are you aiming, are you gearing a lot of the Eagle towards towards the legal reader? I'm curious who your readers are too.
Definitely. Yeah, we do a lot of coverage of the Queens legal justice community. And I think and try to do some of the coverage that maybe the Law Journal isn't doing that's very Queens specific, which I think doesn't really exist in other publications. So that's kind of a nice niche to fill, focusing on the legal community, justice system, the courts, civil and criminal. And then the other broader audience, I think, is just people who care about Queens, whether that's people who currently live in Queens and want to know what's going on in Queens, as Tony mentioned, and as Christian mentioned, just the Queens perspective on stories. So Christian was saying, like, a story about vaccine distribution. Every other larger news outlet, citywide, statewide news outlet, is going to hit those stories. But what's the Queens perspective on that? And I think that's what readers really want to know. And so I think, the people we write about and the people we write for are similar. And that's people who care deeply about Queens, who live in Queens, and who want to know what's going on here.
And Christian, I'm switching just slightly here too. I'm curious who you see as your readers, but also I've noticed, everyone wants to have a podcast these days. And I'm curious if you see with this adaptation over the last year with news outlets that you think that they're coming up with more creative ways to share content digitally, and you foresee that podcasts will continue to flourish and that more of our Queens outlets will be embracing them more. I noticed Schnaps is doing it. I believe I've seen podcasts on your site as well. Is that the future too?
Look, let's just go back a little bit, Jeff, and talk about readers. It's Queens is just so neighborhood by neighborhood. I mean, we have our reporters are on the ground. The way we structure it is I've got, a reporter who lives in LIC. I've got a reporter that lives in Astoria. I live in a sunny side, and also from time to time in Queens Village. I've got a reporter that also works out in a home in Ridgewood. And so everything is so on the ground, but the readers are so vastly different. I mean, Long Island City, everybody is between 25 and 40. Most people aren't even from Queens, have no knowledge of, or have a very limited knowledge of Queens, unless they're in political circles and they follow politics closely. So they're interested very much on events, entertainment, things like that, what's happening, what's new, etc. Whereas your person out in Forest Hills, they probably, these are neighborhoods where there's grandma and grandson, and they're multi-generational, and many people have lived there for a very long time. And so therefore, yes, we want to broaden our base to all ages and ethnicities and anyone that reads English, essentially, but we have to target things so differently by neighborhood. But getting in terms of podcasts, I do see podcasts, becoming more popular, although it's really hard to say because, we could reach saturation point. So therefore, I'm testing it, I'm looking into it, but then I'm sort of thinking, well, I'm talking to politicians at the moment, and I'm thinking, well, how many people really care about, say, a politician or an aspiring candidate, and in a district, that most people in Queens don't live in, and someone they don't really know. So again, it's really testing the waters for me right now in terms of podcasts. And I think most publications are really testing the water right now. I don't think they're, unless you're Joe Rogan, I think you kind of don't know kind of where it's going to go.
Mark, let me go over to you. When it comes to your readers, who do you characterize as your readers? And do you think that has shifted somewhat given COVID-19 in terms of the type of people who are consuming your news?
Well, readership, as it is with most weeklies, which is always the challenge, is having an older readership. But we have prior to COVID, we have a section called Q Borough where we would do 3 or 4 articles each week on upcoming events in Queens or throughout the borough. And also a what's happening page where we had between a page and a half of community calendar and events happening. Another thing that we started about 10 years ago was doing something called the School Spotlight page, where we would offer public and private schools a half a page, anything that they wanted to do to promote their school. And we would offer it to them once a month in one of our editions. So a school could promote, kids who want a science fair or an art contest or whatever it may be. And, regardless of how popular the internet is, no matter what, people still would love to clip that out and put a picture of their kid or their grandkid on the refrigerator. And, it was a great opportunity to profile local people. And we allowed the schools to send, the school sent it to us. It wasn't something that we went out and covered. So it didn't really affect my editorial staff. They were able to do, everything that they do to cover the news. And so we would get that. We haven't done it since the pandemic happened. Obviously, the kids are, for the most part, not in school. So, we try to offer things like that to get a younger readership, but that's certainly always the challenge.
And Walter, something that that was said in the very beginning by Tony in this conversation had been that the online presence was just booming over this past year. Is this something you noticed in the last year, that you saw hits to your website increase substantially? Was there a specific type of content you realized was more appealing to your readers?
First, I just want to say it's so cool to talk to you guys. I miss not talking to you because you know so much about Queens, and we're all in the same boat. It's like there's this feeling, whether you're a publisher, an editor, or a senior reporter, we're all in the same boat, and look at things very much the same way. Yeah, the online presence, it's a thing where all of us always had a challenge of really being able to see some real income from it. And one of the reasons is because we have a real targeted and we have a smaller audience. And when people are looking to advertise, they're saying, well, how many thousands of people do you reach? I'm paying CPM. Well, they're advertising with us and, with Christian because of the brand that his media brings you. And it's different than my brand and different than Tony's brand. And so the online thing's a mixed bag, Jeff. I got to tell you, it's, we're all working a little bit differently. We got some of the COVID money as well, and thank God for the institutional advertising from the city. But I don't get too excited about having more views on our website. We have a metered paywall at the Wave, so people do have to pay. I don't know if it's the right thing to do or not. We don't make that much money from it, but it's definitely a model that we want to use out there. We're doing, we do a daily newsletter, and so I guess you could call that digital and website as well. I mean, when we see people are opening it, when we see that people are joining our contests and our polls, that to me is digital. So I'm going to say yes. There's been a little bit of an uptick, but we push to print because print is king still, and that's important to us.
So let me go over to Tony. I'll start with this next question. It was something from one of our viewers today. And it's interesting because I faced this challenge when I was a reporter as well. And I would be sent into certain communities that I did not know much about. And they were immigrant communities, and I might not have been able to speak Spanish fluently, for instance. And I'm just curious, because how significant immigration issues were in this last year, or even in the last 4 years, and how they will be moving ahead. How do you overcome language and cultural barriers when reporting on different immigrant communities?
Before I answer the question, I just want to add to what Walter said. I agree with Walter. Print is the most important thing. But I feel, and I hope Walter agrees, that the more people that see it online, eventually they'll pick up the paper themselves. So I agree with Walter.
I always agree with you, Tony. Always agree with you. That's so smart.
Thank you, Walter. We always get along. The immigrant issue has been an issue forever. The changes in the different neighborhoods going back from the beginning of time. We have always adjusted over the last 40 years as the Gazette to the different communities that we serve. We've gone into each and every community trying to represent that community and working with the local people that are there. So whatever the ethnic background is, whatever language they are speaking or dealing with, whatever religion, whatever immigration issues are, we've tried to represent the people and to try to tie into what's important to them in each and every neighborhood. But as you said earlier, actually someone else said, somebody say in Forest Hills is different than somebody say in Astoria or somebody say in Far Rockaway. So they are all different, and yet we're all tied in as Queens, but we have to deal with each and every one of those communities in their own way. And the challenge, of course, is we only put the paper out in our end, we're only in English, because I know we couldn't put it out in 110 languages, but we'd love to if we could, but we can't. So that would be my answer, is we try to appease and achieve a positive, proactive approach to every immigrant and every ethnic group. And we try to highlight their strengths, skills, and contributions to our way in Queens. And it is the most diverse place in the world. And you can witness that just by walking on any street and hearing the different languages any day.
And let me just go over to Christian for a moment on that because of the different posts. The Jackson Heights post would have a different population than the Astoria post. So how do you navigate the different language and cultural barriers, or how do your reporters do that?
Yeah, I mean, my attitude is a little different on this one. I mean, no matter what your background is, you're most likely going to be talking to someone different. If you're of Colombian extraction, you're probably going to be talking to a Jamaican person, or if you're a New Zealander like me, you're going to be talking to an Irish person. Everybody's so vastly different. There's very few people that are like with like. So, but in terms of staff, I mean, you know, this publication, it's co-owned by a Filipino immigrant. You know, I'm a Kiwi immigrant. The editors, you know, have been Spanish speaking. That's their first language. I mean, it's just sort of really, it just runs the gamut. And anyone you talk to and you show them some decency and you're patient with them and vice versa, you know, it works out. You know, I can be talking to the Indian guy about cricket, you know, I can talk to the English guy about rugby. It's just everybody's human and we all get along and we just give it our best shot. And it seems to work out, you know. So Queens is great like that. Queens has been terrific to me and terrific to everybody I've worked with. And you know, people are people, and immigrants, if you treat them nicely, they treat you nicely and vice versa. So it's worked out.
So Mark, obviously we've talked, you know, we often hear about the war on media. There was a report that came out pre-pandemic finding that local news across the country was suffering. So how do we reshape the public's thinking of local journalism as a public good?
It's not an easy one.
I'll give you 10 minutes. No.
You know, anytime I ever hear the term fake news, it makes me cringe. It's, you know, I really don't like it. And, you know, I've heard it from somebody who reads an article in my newspaper and they don't like it and they say, oh, you're just fake news. And, you know, we really do, you know, my newspaper does not have a political bent. We really don't take sides. We just try to report on the community. We, you know, we cover Democrats, we cover Republicans, all types of Democrats. And, you know, I just think if you could just be a straight shooter and not take sides outside of your editorial page, you know, present the news fairly, and, you know, people are always going to criticize. There's no way to avoid that. People are always going to criticize you, but, you know, you have to have your morals, you have to have your values. And as long as you feel you're presenting the news properly, that's really all you can do.
So now we're coming to the close in about 8 minutes, and I just want to go around once again, and I'll go alphabetically once again. I'd like each of you to make an impassioned case for why local journalism matters for communities in Queens and for our democracy, lowercase d. I'll start over with Tony Barsamian.
I think the local news is urgent for our democracy. And I think it's urgent for each community because, like many of us said, you can get the New York Times or the New York Post or the Daily News, and they're going to cover things on a much larger, bigger scale. They might not even cover it just from the city angle. We're going to cover it from the Queens angle if we're a Queens newspaper. And we're going to cover it from the local angle as much as we can. So yes, COVID, for example, when it was reported that it was going to be at the Queens Theater, we immediately covered that, and we were questioning why it would be in that location because we didn't feel that was a convenient transportation-oriented hub such as instead Citi Field, which is much easier to get to, or other places. And so we're always going to cover the media from a local angle, and it is part of the democracy because you can't make an informed decision about your elected officials if you don't know what's going on and how it impacts you locally directly. So I would stress, please, everyone, read your local community newspapers, the different ones that are on the panel here today, and all the other papers in Queens. Read them every day, every week, wherever you can. It makes a difference in the long run. If we weren't here, you wouldn't know what's going on so easily and so quickly. And fortunately, we're a good group here, and I appreciate being on this panel today. Thank you.
Thank you. Katie Bliss, talk a little about, make your impassioned case for why local journalism matters.
Absolutely. It really does. And, you're going to find out where the vaccines are being distributed and how many tests have been taken and who's positive and who isn't. You're going to be bombarded with that all day long on TV, on your phone, in your social media. But if you want to find out what happens in Terminal 4 or who the new executive is going to be, or where the next job opportunity, who's got the RFPs, what businesses are thriving, and if you're interested in that, and I speak about it from the terms of the airport, but yes, in Long Island City or Astoria or Queens or whatever, you're not going to get that anywhere else but with these people that are on the streets talking to the people. And if you're not talking to the people, you have no idea what's going on. And that's what we do. We talk to everybody, and we see what's going on and we see what's important, and we bring it to you.
David Brand, tell our listeners today, our viewers today, why local journalism matters, why the Queens Daily Eagle's journalism matters.
Well, I think just to follow up on what Kate said, it was a great point, is what I was thinking. Our best sources are our readers. And that's because we in local news, reporters, editors, staff, management are so connected and so accessible to the community. And I think that translates into the stories that we are reporting and writing. We are able to elevate the voices of people in the community in a way that larger news organizations really aren't, because they're taking maybe a more global perspective. We're taking a very in the community, on the ground, on your block approach to our reporting. And you send us an email, we're going to get right back to you. You send us an email, we may be the only reporters interested in this, but we're going to be really interested in what you have on your mind. And the same goes for our opinion pages. We're going to be featuring the voices of people in our communities, and there's not many venues that can say that. So local news is so key. Local news in the community, and local news is really elevating the voices of everyday people in the community in a way that most news organizations aren't.
Thanks, David. Christian Murray, make the case why local journalism matters for our communities.
Well, I think it matters in many respects. I mean, take a little local rezoning. People in a neighborhood, it really matters to them. Your New York Times, your Post isn't going to cover that, but a development that may have 150 units that's going to go through ULIP, it's not really going to get covered outside of local news. So if that matters to you, local news makes a lot of sense. What your local council member does, the bills that they're putting forward, you can look at that more on a micro level that a big paper won't do. You can see where are the funds being allocated to, in a district. Where is your council member putting it toward? Are they putting it towards schools? Are they putting it toward parks? You're not going to see that anywhere else. Who are they getting their contributions from? Things like that. These are all things that local news can provide that are bigger, that more regional publications can't provide. So I think, if people want those sorts of things, and me as a resident of Queens, that's the sort of thing I would like to know myself. So I think, if people want that, they should come to all of us here and, seek it out.
Thank you. Walter Sanchez, final thoughts on, and then I'll come to Mark, your thoughts on why local journalism matters.
I miss local youth sports. I miss having a 12-year-old kid hitting a layup on my back page of the paper, and that's why you buy these papers. So original content is in our DNA. If you don't know who Raimondo Graziano is or Kenichi Wilson, they're one of 7 candidates that are running in District 32. If you don't know who Nancy Martinez is, she's one of 12 candidates running for the city council special election in Far Rockaway. We're the only place you could find that, these local newspapers, and all of the people who are on this panel do just that. So it's in our DNA to do original content that nobody else does. This is the only place you're going to read about that. And that's our duty, is to bring that to the public, is who these people are, who Khalid Al-Amari is. You wouldn't know unless you read our papers. So that's my pitch for why you should read local journalism.
And Mark Weidler, you get to round it up today in the final minute that we have. Talk about, make the case for why local journalism matters.
I had mentioned earlier about the story we posted on Friday night about the vaccine being available at Aqueduct Racetrack beginning yesterday. And between the number of comments on the website or people calling my office and asking just simple questions like, is it the Pfizer vaccine or Moderna vaccine? Is it drive-through or do you walk in? And, when it's walk in, well, my mother is disabled. Is there handicap parking? And, other readers were answering questions. Of course, when they were calling my office and they wanted to know how they could sign up, that's what we're here for. We are providing what matters to people. They may want to know about wars. They may want to know what's going on. Obviously, they want to know what's going on in Washington. But this is what matters to their lives. Whether, as Walter mentioned, who's running in District 32 or any of the other local elections, or the vaccines, or what to do. What we report is what matters.
Mark, thank you so much. I just want to, as I get ready to close, thank everyone. Thank our panelists, Tony Barsamian, Katie Bliss, David Brand, Christian Murray, Walter Sanchez, and Mark Weidler. I again want to thank Tom Grech and the Queen's Chamber and Jeff Gross for making this happen. I'm going to toss it over to Tom in a second, but one thing we will try to do to answer some of your questions that also came in, when this video is posted online, we will see how we can, if possible, even hyperlink to each one of these news sites. So you'll be able to go over there and make sure if you're a candidate or someone else who's interested in advertising, definitely please check them out. Tom Grech, back to you.
Just wanted to say thanks to everybody, all of our panelists, and especially to Jeff. I never could have handled the Q&A as expertly as you did. You're a gem. You're a Jackson Heights gem. We appreciate your partnership and your friendship. And again, to all of our publishers out there, I think you nailed it. You nailed it about the importance of the hyper local, block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood, what makes Queens different. And I'm going to leave you with this. When I first got to meet Melinda Katz when she was borough president, in talking about Queens, people don't say they're from Queens. I married a girl from Brooklyn and she's from Brooklyn. But when you're from Queens, I'm from Astoria. My mom and dad are from Astoria, right? Walter lives in Maspeth. Jeff lives in Jackson Heights. It's a neighborhood thing. And I think we have a debt to each of you as publishers for doing what you do. I hope nothing but the best. Clear skies ahead. And thank you very much. I'll leave the last word to Jeff Simmons.
And that was it. All I was going to just say is thank you once again. And again, I don't know if Tom, you just said this or not. If you want to learn more about the chamber, go to queenschamber.org to learn more. There are many other virtual events you'll want to check out. Thanks everyone for tuning in today.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Take care now.
Tony, talk to you later.